Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Gillikin. I'm with Livable Cville. We're an all-volunteer group whose mission is to advocate for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods welcoming to all. This is our second talk in our series on zoning in Charlottesville. Our first talk was with UVA grad Dr. Jenny Schutz from the Brookings Institute in DC. She talked about zoning and affordability. I will drop a recording of that talk into the chat in a little bit. Wanted to quickly catch everyone up to speed on the Cville plans process, which is what we're going through as a city right now as we try to solve our affordable housing crisis. In March of 2021, the City Council approved the affordable housing plan, and then in November approved the comprehensive plan, and now is working on the zoning rewrite, which is about as boring as things can get in certain respects, but is incredibly impactful in our community. So that process is underway. And I communicated with James Fries, the Director of Neighborhood Development Services, and they're expecting to have some information out soon about a bit more about how that process is going to play out, some of the methods that are going to be used. And then community outreach will be starting in a month or so. So this talk is designed to help educate ourselves in our community about some areas that we can improve our zoning code and help address our affordable housing and zoning issues. So 20% of the land in Charlottesville City is parking. If you're wondering why, it's because it's required by our zoning code in many cases. Any new construction or redevelopment is required to have a minimum number of parking spots. So this causes a series of problems, kind of a domino effect in many ways. And we at Livable Cville wanted to learn more and think better about this. So I reached out to Dr. Donald Shoup at UCLA, who literally wrote the book on parking, 700-page book called The High Cost of Free Parking. And he was very gracious. He responded to me quickly and said, I'm too busy, but I know a fellow named Andrew Mondschein at UVA. He knows what I know, but actually knows Charlottesville too, so he'd be better than me. So I reached out to Dr. Mondschein, and he was very gracious and very accommodating. A little bit about him. He's an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at UVA School of Architecture, and he's the associate dean of research. He studies transportation systems and travel behavior, seeking to foster equitable, sustainable accessibility in cities and regions. His research addresses the rapidly changing terrain of transportation and information technologies, identifying means to assert social imperatives during a period of urban transformation. He teaches a range of transportation courses, including Introduction to Transportation Planning and Policy, Transportation and Land Use, and Transportation in the Environment. So I think we've got someone here who's pretty well qualified to talk on this topic. And he's going to speak to us for a little bit, and then we are going to have a pretty good amount of time to do some question and answer. So you'll be able to put questions into the chat, and those will go to me and Dr. Mondschein, and then I'll help facilitate that Q&A when we get to that point. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Mondschein.
Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate being invited, even as a replacement for Donald Shoup. You know, it's actually a great opportunity. And I'm glad to be here. And I think, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I go ahead and start sharing my screen, and then, you know, I'll talk a little bit about the big ideas and how I, you know, would hope to talk about them, and we'll dive in. So let me see. I'm going to hit share screen, and okay. Let's see, I need to switch this, I think. Do you see kind of a title screen now?
Yep, that's great.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, thanks. The beginning of any Zoom presentation is now done. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. And actually, I'm really glad you brought up Donald Shoup. Donald Shoup was my professor. Donald Shoup, you know, I did my graduate work at UCLA, where Donald Shoup is an emeritus professor. And I had the opportunity to read chapters of The High Cost of Free Parking, this book that has made Donald Shoup famous in a very limited circle. And I think one of the notable things to say about the high cost of free parking is that it is the Planners Press, the American Planning Association's book imprint. It is their #1 selling title of all time. So even though parking is this thing that who thinks about parking? It has become for planners one of the critical issues of the past 20 years, thanks in large part to Donald Shoup. So just a little bit about me, and already Matthew, you gave a great introduction, but I do have a slight obsession with parking myself. And one of the things that I really like to think about with parking is what we could do with the space that we devote to parking. And so here's just a couple of images from daily life. Some of you may have seen if you were traveling down University during parking day, which is the third Friday in September, that the students at UVA take over the space in front of the Bank of America for turning parking into parks on parking day. And just a representation of what we could do with curb space, as well as here in a garage. I like to try to teach my transportation planning and policy class at least once every year inside of a parking garage to show that you can fit a whole class into 2 spaces, which once we look at the cost of parking, shows how we set our priorities sometimes and how skewed it might seem. So the final thing I'll say is just that I come to this by not being just an academic, but when I finished the work I was doing, when I finished my master's degree, I worked in Los Angeles as a transportation and land use planner, and parking always came up. Parking was always the reason why we couldn't have nice things. And I think today, a lot of the talk is going to be around why is that and what are the consequences of being so focused on providing parking when we want to do anything, when we want to build housing, when we want to build anything in our cities or regions. Okay, so today, I think, just a quick overview, the things I'd like to cover. First of all, I'd like to talk about some of the consequences of off-street parking requirements. And I am going to focus on off-street parking, this idea of what is required by the zoning code, because that's what Charlottesville, the city, is really thinking about right now, is the cost of housing and how we settle, how we address that issue partially through planning, through densification, and through changing the zoning code. So I want to focus on that. But I also, want to talk a little bit about indirect costs to sustainability, traffic congestion, urban form, what we want to see in a city. So I want to talk about consequences. And of course, I'd like to talk about solutions, not just eliminating parking minimums, which is the focus, but other sorts of approaches, establishing better parking districts, providing transportation options besides just driving and parking in a private lot. All of those things are things that I want to cover today and talk about. Throughout, hopefully it will come across that I think part of the emphasis we need to have is on equity, and I'll talk about how I think that comes through in the decisions we make around parking as a city and as a society. And I'll talk mostly about Charlottesville, the city, our city, and I am a resident of the city of Charlottesville, I might add. So we'll talk a little bit about, we'll focus primarily on the city of Charlottesville, but I'll say a little bit about Albemarle, and we'll speak more broadly. And I would say that in terms of questions, in terms of things you want to talk about, this can go in a lot of directions. So I really am looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to present some ideas, but believe me, there's a lot we could talk about, and a lot of rabbit holes that actually aren't rabbit holes. They're really important things that we could follow down. So I'm looking forward to that at the end of the talk. Okay, so first thing that is important to say is that when we talk about transportation, and I'm a transportation planner, we spend so much time talking about traffic. We spend so much time talking about alternatives to traffic flows, to walking and biking and all of those important things. But it's really true that most of the time, and this is something that Donald Shoup certainly drilled into my head, most of the time cars are parked. Most of the time when we're trying to deal with cars, we're really trying to deal with where they rest, basically, where we leave them when we're not inside of them. And another really important part about the power of parking is that as planners, and by the way, when I say planners, I mean not just planners alone, but city councils, voters voting for city councils and voting for administrations, we actually have a lot more control over where we park, how we park, where, how much parking we provide than we do over people's travel behavior. Ultimately, people are free agents. And frankly, VDOT makes a lot of rules about roads and road standards. Cities actually have some say about where cars get stored. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, that when we think about parking, yes, we're going to talk a lot about the impact on development itself, but it has a lot of effects in a really important way on travel and sustainability and the equity of our travel patterns that really are hard to address as cities and as locals, other than through parking. Now, of course, like I said, I do want to focus on how parking is a major determinant of the cost of development. So we'll look at that. We'll look at that significantly. And then finally, I think the important thing that I'd like to say upfront about parking is the fact that making parking so abundant and free, and the fact that we have come to expect as a society that we should have free parking wherever we go. And if we have to pay, we're a little disgruntled. And if it's not there, we're really disgruntled. By doing that as a society, we've really put our thumb on the scale for a car-based society and a car-based mobility. And that has many consequences that we can talk about. I think from an equity point of view, it's important to remember that by doing that, we fundamentally, in terms of the money we spend and the money we ask private developers to spend, are favoring people who already have cars. We're not doing anything for anyone who doesn't have a car. And we are still requiring people who don't have vehicles to pay for that choice, to pay for the choice to put so much parking in the world. We make people pay not just directly and not just by the cost of housing or the increased cost of housing, but all of the things like congestion and pollution and crashes that really are, that really affect everyone, and in fact often affect people with the least access to cars the most. So those are some of the really important things about parking and why we think about parking so much today. All right, let's see. All right, so let's start with the zoning code. And important to say, this is from the Charlottesville zoning code. This is one table. You can Google Charlottesville zoning code and look at the entire zoning code as it stands today. Right now we are fundamentally in this moment of rethinking what should be in our zoning code, which is why this, conversation about parking is so important. But this is a table for multifamily dwellings and the requirements for parking that are currently in the standard. I think really importantly, there are more details than this. There are exceptions, there are bonuses, there are things like that frankly, if we have time to talk about, we can. But fundamentally, this is the base table. This is where it starts. And it says that multifamily dwellings, 1-bedroom units or studios require 1 space per unit, 2-bedroom units, also 1 space per unit. And then 3- and 4-bedroom units require a little bit more, and so on. This is a minimum parking requirement. This is what zoning codes all over the United States have inside of them. This just happens to be ours. And this is a rule. This is just a rule that is telling us that if you want to build a building, you have to make, in this case, a multifamily dwelling, you have to make sure to provide this much parking. Again, with some exceptions, but this is the fundamental idea behind a minimum parking requirement. And this I definitely took from the High Cost of Free Parking, that Donald Shoup's book, but I love this table so much. The idea that we could estimate and prescribe so precisely the number of spaces necessary for different uses is built into the idea of minimum parking requirements, that we could know how many spaces every single building needs, every single unit needs, is inherent to the idea that we need to legislate this, and ultimately a zoning code is a form, well, it's a standard, but it's fundamentally a type of legislation. The ones here I'll just leave for you to look at. There are some funny ones that have appeared over time in different places, but even the idea of multifamily housing minimum parking requirements, it makes sense, right? On some level, you think, well, if we're requiring 1 space per bedroom or multiple spaces, or 1 space per unit or 2 spaces for multiple bedrooms, I get that. That makes sense. We're just trying to accommodate the fact that people are likely to drive, and we want them to be able to, we want this to not be a problem later on in the life of the building or in the life of the unit. But the truth is that the demand for parking, why people need parking, is incredibly variable for all sorts of reasons. It's variable because of the person. Do they have a car? Do they want to have a car? It's variable because of the location. Do you live in the middle of Charlottesville in a walkable area? Or do you live on the edge of Greene County where there's nothing that's accessible and there's no transit and there's not even a sidewalk? All of those things are not respected by a zoning code. A really good zoning code, small area plans, things like that, will do a little bit better with those things. But the idea of setting requirements, but then not really thinking about how those requirements might vary from place to place, is a large part of the problem. Now, I want to get right to it. And you'll see a lot of my examples are going to be from Charlottesville. We're here in Charlottesville. These are things that certainly I'm really interested in, and I know you all are interested in. So sometimes I'll have examples not from Charlottesville, but this one is from Charlottesville. This is from the this is from the study that was done around affordable housing a couple of years ago. Paid for by the city. The source is Partners for Economic Solutions. And what I'd like you to look at here is just a simple fact. The fact that this study looked at the ability to provide affordable housing in different situations. I'm just showing you the table for downtown development so downtown Charlottesville. And what it shows at different levels of stories and things like that, which all have a big impact. If parking can be supplied at half a space per unit, or in other words, one space per 2 units, then it is much more feasible, according to the economic calculations in that study, which I don't have linked here, but certainly we can provide access to. It shows that it's much easier to provide more affordable housing at less parking per unit. And I think intuitively we know why that is, but I'd like to kind of bring that home a little bit to talk about why that is. So in that study, that the table I just kind of showed you was in the study that table came from, they list a little bit about costs, estimated costs for Charlottesville in 2018, and that a surface lot costs $5,000 per space. An above ground parking lot costs $20,000 per space, and a below ground parking lot costs $32,000 per space. That was their estimate in 2018. I've seen other estimates. I looked up one, more recently, and structured parking now can cost, on average, upward of $25,000. $25,000 per space. So if you need 2 spaces, I get all else being equal, but if you need 2 spaces, then suddenly you're stuck with an extra $50,000 of costs. Now, of course, really important to say, devil is in the details, and it's important to note that how do we build spaces? Are they tandem spaces? Are we building are we building underground? Are we building above ground? All of those things come into play, and there's lots of there are lots of good studies about that look at those details. But I think that overall, what it tells us is that it's a significant cost to developers to supply parking. On top of that, it also makes it a lot harder to build densely. So this image on the right, that's actually from some of the work that I did when I was a working planner before I went back to school to become a professor. And so this is an image actually from Los Angeles, from suburban Los Angeles. And this was a project I worked on. And like I said, we had terrible troubles making the dense mixed-use housing that we wanted to build pencil out, working with our economic analyst, because that city required one space per unit. And so here, with one townhouse and one ADU, or accessory dwelling unit above the garage, we had to provide 2 parking spaces. And that was very expensive. And that made the whole thing much harder for developers to justify. Now, really importantly, we could say, well, it's expensive, but people need parking. People want to park. They need to park where they need to park right next to their house. They need to park right where they live. Well, the evidence doesn't really bear that out. Absolutely, people use parking. And I think, one of the themes I want to return to, if I could, and we could talk about more over time, is the fact that we're still going to have parking. Cars are part of society, and we are going to need to provide parking. But the evidence is clear, and study after study shows that especially with multifamily housing, which is primarily what we're talking about right now, developers are forced to oversupply parking. Not all of the parking they supply gets used. That's especially true for affordable housing. And that those costs ultimately have to be passed on to tenants. If it's affordable housing, of course, that means there has to be extra financing. There has to be additional revenues coming from the city, coming from the state, whatever, coming from the federal level in order to support the housing. But that this is wasted money to a great degree. That ultimately people do use parking, but even when we build out to these current minimum parking requirements, not everything gets used.
Dr. Mondschein,
Oh yeah, yes.
quick question that came up when you were showing those cost estimates in Charlottesville. The question was, are those just simply the raw construction costs that a developer had and not a broader kind of societal costs?
Absolutely. Yes, great question. Yes, and we will get into the societal costs, but these are just, I wanted to start with just pure cost of housing, without any of the indirect costs, which we should talk about. One other thing I want to say, and I think is important for this conversation, is that even now, significant portions of the population of Charlottesville do not even have a car. It is not the majority, but when we look at renter-occupied housing units, and this is from the American Community Survey, so the U.S. Census, this is the data that incorporates up through the year 2020. It shows that 1,700, almost 1,800 households, renter-occupied households, don't have a car. And 305 owner-occupied households don't have a car either in Charlottesville. And there are a lot of other households. In fact, when you add in the one vehicle households, the majority of households in Charlottesville do not have more than one car. So they fundamentally, these are households that either don't have cars or are using cars for some trips, but even if they have multiple members of the household, they don't use it for all their trips. So there's a lot of room in the city, even now, even in the way we're built out, with the level of transit we have and all of those things, to get around without a car. And so assuming that everyone needs a car, everyone needs a parking space is a mistake fundamentally. And I'll just leave that there for the moment, because we can come back to things like that. But I think that there is a bigger picture. So the housing cost aspect is really important. And that is the issue of the day in Charlottesville, and a really important one is, how are we going to provide affordable housing? And parking is a big part of the problem, especially when parking is not something that a lot of affordable housing developers think they need to supply at such high levels. But let's think about the other consequences as well. And I really like this diagram by another scholar, Richard Wilson. And what it shows is that when we set high parking requirements, in other words, we make parking supply exceed demand, there are a lot of consequences. I'll start with the loop on the right. This is the loop we deal with off-street parking requirements, the things in the zoning code. Well, what we end up with is lowering site densities. We end up therefore making each parcel of land less useful. And I think, important to say this has land value, but ultimately it has less use value, because we're fundamentally saying any use, whether it's housing or shopping or a hospital, we have to provide so much parking that this land, we need more land to do the same thing, basically, which leads to what we call automobile-oriented site design, where we have large sprawling parking lots and all of those things. When we require high levels of parking, our urban form changes. It becomes sprawling. This is what sprawl is all about. That word that has no good definition, but then we know it when we see it. That's what sprawl is. At the same time, on the behavior side, I'm a transportation planner, so I do think about travel behavior. When we don't make people pay for parking, people start to treat parking like it's water, and they drive more. They base their sense of the cost of travel on the idea that it will always be free to park. And so we do end up driving more. So those things are cyclical, because then they come back and tell planners, oh, look at all this demand for parking. We need to make sure that that much parking is always supplied. Now, importantly, this is on average, this is societally, and we err towards providing more parking than people really need. And again, for issues like affordable housing, we might have reason to say these standards are particularly uncalled for. But what does that lead to? Well, it leads to sprawl, it leads to auto-oriented urban form, it leads to low densities, and that leads to more driving, which means more traffic congestion, and it means more pollution, and it means more energy consumption, even if we all have Teslas, and that's going to be a long time coming, or electric cars generally. The energy consumption and the effects on climate change are all going to be increased because we make it so easy to drive, on top of the fact that it makes it much harder for us to build the society we want to build. And of course, the equity consequences as well. I'd like to talk about those some more. We will come to those, that all of these consequences are often borne specifically by low-income populations, by Black populations, by immigrant populations, and we can talk about that. So really importantly, I want to return to this. Does getting rid of minimum parking requirements, and that's really the idea we're talking about today. So saying that you don't need to set a zoning standard for parking, but just let it float. Let developers do what they're going to do. Does that mean that we're not going to provide any parking? Well, the answer is very much no. That doesn't mean that at all. Removing a parking requirement doesn't mean that developers won't supply parking. They're going to base their choices on how much parking to supply based on perceived demand, what they think the need is, what they think that the population that's going to live on their site or travel to their store really needs. It can be based on other city policies and standards. It can be based around things like form-based code, which fundamentally sets the idea that streets and sidewalks and neighborhoods it's more important to structure how they look really, and how they provide opportunities for activity and social meeting places and economic activity than it really is around setting quantitative standards. All of those things are still going to be there. It just means that we're not forcing developers to supply so much parking. So it gives a choice basically. And again, for affordable housing particularly, those funds can focus on what people really need, on what the demand really is. So I think, what does it mean? What are these indirect costs? I started to talk about this, but minimum parking requirements don't just lead to higher housing costs. The more spread out buildings mean it's harder to walk and to bike. So, and that means it's also harder to get to transit. And again, this is a type of mobility that is more utilized by low-income folks, people who don't own cars, the people we're trying to actually supply better mobility to. This is really important, and this is something we've been thinking about as a society more and more lately, but having fewer trees because of all the need for parking lots means that we reduce the urban canopy. And this is something that Charlottesville has been struggling with over the past decades, that we've been losing our tree canopy. What does that do? Well, that increases local neighborhood temperatures, often in the neighborhoods where health issues are highest, and where accessibility and affordability issues are the worst. Parking, needing to supply more parking leads to the loss of a tree canopy. Inducing more driving by providing all this parking leads to more crashes. And of course, it creates more traffic on already congested roads. This is a really important part about Charlottesville, and we'll come back to it. But I think everyone's noticed we don't have wide roads here. We do not have capacity for more traffic. And this has been a complaint. But at the same time, we can solve for this by providing alternatives to driving. Roads like Preston, roads like Park Street coming into downtown are, roads like Emmett are very packed. And the the idea that we would be able to widen them would, one, be very expensive and probably not be feasible, politically feasible and community feasible. So providing more parking to just pour more cars onto congested roads is not necessarily what we want to be doing. And of course, I think really importantly, not providing housing in the urban center because it's too expensive, or reducing the amount of housing we can provide, just pushes affordable housing past the urban center to the fringes of where we live, which just requires people to spend more time on the road, which puts the burden of commuting on those who can least afford to commute. And that is another big part of the challenge. Okay, so what are the implications though? You know, I think it's very fair for us to ask a little bit, if we don't provide so much, if we don't require developers to provide so much parking, what are the consequences? Well, I think that there can be consequences if we don't provide alternatives to driving to travelers. But that is a big part of this problem, is that we need to do it in a comprehensive way. And in fact, I want to say, as I hope I'll say again, Charlottesville's new comprehensive plan is very thoughtful about all of this. It does not talk about one thing only. It does not talk about just less parking. It also talks about providing alternatives of travel. And so we just need to ask ourselves as a society, can people get where they need to go? What alternatives might people have to owning a private vehicle and storing it where they live? And by the way, that doesn't mean not driving. That just means not having a car in a garage underneath your bedroom. And so those sorts of questions are questions we need to ask ourselves before we say that we need all this parking. Why? Well, fewer spaces can still be shared spaces. Mixed-use developments can balance residential and commercial parking needs. This is a big part of the whole idea of why we support mixed-use development as planners. Managing parking at the district level rather than at the parcel level, another thing that Donald Shoup has really spoken about, is another way that we can provide enough parking for everyone to have a place, if they want to have a car, to park their car, but then not necessarily require so much parking that we have lots of empty fields of asphalt on a day, every day of the year. And of course, all the alternatives, walking, biking, transit, car sharing, and ride sharing, are all possibilities. And they're all things that as a city, we can invest in, we are investing in, and we can consider how we can do better and we can do more. I think it's really important to say, and I've come back to this a couple of times, but when we say no more parking minimums, that does not mean that developers will even necessarily not supply the amount of parking they would have supplied with the minimums. So this is information, this is from a study done by another scholar, Michael Manville, looking at parking in downtown Los Angeles. And I will say, Charlottesville is not Los Angeles. That's not the point here. The point is just simply to say they had an experiment with their parking minimums where they got rid of them in their downtown area, so that affordable reuse of existing buildings could be more feasible. And what they found, in fact, for the apartments built under the new zoning code in downtown Los Angeles, is that developers actually, on average, ended up supplying more parking than the old minimums would have required. And that's what you see here in this chart on the apartment side. Now, the important thing to say, though, is that some buildings and some developers provided no parking, and some provided more than they needed to. And this is just the average here on the left bar. But it was ultimately a choice, and it was not us as planners and as a society putting our thumb on the scale to say you have to provide this parking. But it was a decision left to developers and their very, very complex financial models to decide that, yes, this building is worth building even without the parking. And many other cities, I will add, have moved in this direction over time. Small cities and large cities across the country, and we can talk about that a little bit more, because I want to make sure to keep moving so there's enough time for our discussion. Now, coming to Charlottesville again and coming to the comprehensive plan, I think it's really important to say that we can do this. I think Charlottesville is very well positioned as a city, as a built form, as a network of roads and land uses and all the things that make up our city. We are really well placed to actually get rid of minimum parking requirements. First of all, we do have many existing compact areas in the city. We already do travel more on foot, by bike, and by transit than most Virginians do. Matthew, you alluded to this in terms of parking. In terms of roadways, only about 10% of our land is devoted to roads and sidewalks. That is really low. That is very low compared to most other places. And we know it by the number of one-lane roads and the number of complex intersections and all those fun things that we deal with as Charlottesvillians. That means we don't really have a lot of capacity, and we will not ever have a lot of capacity to add vehicles to our roads. And we should think about ways to do this to build more densely without adding vehicles to the roads for all the reasons we've already talked about. Looking at this map from the comprehensive plan, the 2021 comprehensive plan, it shows that most of our developable land is in places like Emmett Street or maybe near the Ravenna River, where there is too much parking, where we can drive to Seminole Square and see lots of empty land. And it's not empty land, but land that potentially could be used for other purposes besides seas of asphalt. And I want to point out again, something that I started talking about before, but that we really need to remember the counterfactual here, because I think one of the problems we have, and I know this is a problem with the comprehensive plan when we talked about it overall, as a society, not me personally, but as a city, we often, it was easy to become nervous about densification and to think, well, what are the consequences of that? But it's really important to remember that the consequences of not building more affordable housing are not that nothing will happen and everything will stay the same. That is not what's going to happen. What will happen is that all the affordable housing will be built, as it already is happening, beyond Albemarle County. Some in Albemarle County, but a lot of it is going to be in Greene County or in the Shenandoah Valley or in Buckingham County. And people will need to drive in long distances, polluting more, exposing more people to more cars, making trips that are very long, making their lives worse. That is the consequence of not doing more and finding ways to provide density in Charlottesville. And I think it's important to remember too, from an equity point of view, if we do that, that means that some current residents and historical residents, people who have lived or their families have lived in Charlottesville for a very long time, just won't be able to live here anymore. So I think that counterfactual is really important. And it's important to understand how the choices we make, even in the devil in the details of parking and zoning codes, lead to those sorts of outcomes. And so when we think about the solutions that we're talking about here, or the changes we're talking about to the way we plan, let's not imagine things will stay the same. Things will change. They'll just change in a way that actually makes a lot of the things that we don't want, like congestion, like pollution, all of those things, worse. Okay, so yes, there are some, I'm coming to the end here, everybody, but I think there are some important things for us to think about before we wrap up. One is that there are ways to manage parking. A lot of people, are worried, well, if we don't supply any more parking, if we don't require developers to supply parking, when people do drive into the city or drive from another neighborhood, they're going to spill over into my neighborhood and take up my parking. Well, that might be true, but we do have a tool. And in fact, Charlottesville already uses that tool, which is residential parking districts. I think one of the important things is to think about, where are our districts? How do we decide to put those districts down? It's usually from the squeaky wheel, and they often are not, the neighborhood that is upset about students parking, in their single family neighborhood. But these sorts of tools can be used by neighborhoods with more affordable housing, or sensitive neighborhoods, as the comprehensive plan talks about. Those are places where we could consider these types of districts and fundamentally help people who live in an area have access to shared parking, on-street parking, things like that. Equity in this case is always about who benefits. It's not that parking is good or bad, or residential parking districts are good or bad, but it's about who is getting the benefit, and are we remembering to provide opportunities for access, for mobility to everyone in our city. I think in the bigger picture, I just want to say as we come to the end that it's important to remember it's not just about off-street parking minimums. It's about better parking management overall, and the provision of alternatives to car ownership and driving. It's, it's one of those things, we're talking about housing a lot right now, but all trips have origins and destinations. And again, this is an example where Charlottesville has done good work, and has a great parking study that was done a couple of years ago, looking at our economic centers, the corner and downtown Charlottesville. And that study made a lot of great recommendations about what we should be doing overall to deal with the issues of parking. A lot of these things haven't been implemented. There was an attempt to, for example, charge for on-street parking in downtown Charlottesville in order to manage the supply of on-street parking in Charlottesville a little bit better. The very sad confluence of this parking trial to charge for parking and the events of August 2017, unfortunately, put the business owners of downtown in great distress, and they were worried that charging for parking was hurting their business. Unfortunately, we never saw any data on that. We don't know if that's true or not, because unfortunately the studies that should have been done were never done. But the ideas of understanding that we should optimize our parking resources, that we should charge the right price for parking, we need to provide alternatives with better transit, better walking, and better biking, as well as potentially car sharing and ride sharing, are all part of this. And fundamentally, this is again something you might want to look at in more detail. But fundamentally, nothing in that plan says that more parking cannot be built. There may be very good reasons to build more parking, but that it should be based not on some knee-jerk decision that there's an undersupply of parking already, but to allow other approaches to exist at the same time, charging the right price for parking, providing alternatives. And then, and only then, when it seems like there is no other choice, then maybe it is time to supply more parking. So this is an important part of what we do, and it deals with the destination as well as just the origin of our trips. Finally, I just want to kind of point out that there are a lot of creative ideas out in the world beyond what we've talked about around how we manage parking. This is from Seattle, but they're trying to be more flexible with parking. And they're trying to say that all the land that we supply to parking in neighborhoods, in this case, you can look on the left in residential neighborhoods, really should not just be about car storage. We need to remember what we want to do with our public land, and that it needs to support mobility, walking, biking, and transit. That's the number one thing there, but also access for people, allowing people to basically get between buildings, allowing commerce to happen. So that could be even something as 2020 as a food truck. But all of these things are also uses for our parking space. And we need to think about parking not in a vacuum, but as something that is a trade-off, that there are opportunity costs with what we do. All right, so almost done here, but I didn't talk a lot about Albemarle County, but I think it is important to say that they have an upcoming comprehensive plan update too. And yes, it's a very different environment, but fundamentally what no parking minimums is saying is the same for Albemarle County as it is for the city of Charlottesville. It doesn't mean that parking won't be supplied. It just means that context can matter more, and that the decisions, are we in the middle of Crozet, or are we on the far fringes of the development areas? All of those things can come into play when those decisions get made. Of course, I think Albemarle can do well to continue to focus on development in centers, investing in good walk and bike connectivity. And I think the demand responsive transit pilot in Albemarle County is a great way of thinking about how non-fixed route bus service can be an alternative to owning a private vehicle and parking it under your bedroom. All of those things are, and this, by the way, what is demand responsive transit? Well, it's basically public transit Ubers. So, thinking about what that is a really great thing that Albemarle is doing. Okay, so just to reiterate, this is the last slide. The vicious cycle of sprawl can be counteracted with a virtuous cycle. In addition to eliminating parking minimums for all the reasons we talked about, I think using parking districts to deal with spillover is important. Charging the right price for parking in commercial areas and fundamentally managing parking better in our commercial areas can complement what we do with off-street minimums in residential areas. And fundamentally providing more and better transportation options. All of these things need to happen to create virtuous cycles. So building out our bike ped network, we've got a good start, but we have a long way to go. I am so excited about the regional transit partnership and the work being done to make transit more effective in our region. Investing in innovative transit, so I alluded to the demand responsive transit, and thinking about overall how car sharing and ride sharing, which are fundamentally things that are seen as high cost and not available to people who don't already own cars. How can we make those available to more people? And then fundamentally coming back to land use and why we're talking about this in the first place, building more densely, building in centers. These are all things that if we do that, then eliminating minimum parking requirements is going to be an easy choice. It's going to allow for more choices of how we live. It's going to allow us to build the way we need to build at less cost. And I think that ultimately it will lead to a Charlottesville that supports everyone who wants to live here and who needs to live here, and fundamentally provides for the goals of equity and sustainability that are so critical right now in our history. Okay.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll go to some questions. If you all have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. It will go to me and I can ask Dr. Mondschein. I have a question to start. You've mostly talked about multifamily developments. 70% or so of the residential land in Charlottesville has been zoned R1 single family exclusionary. The comp plan and the future land use map are looking to move away from that. What are some helpful ways of both thinking about getting rid of parking requirements in low density residential areas and also convincing skeptical neighbors that that's not a bad thing? Because there's a sense of that's my on-street spot in addition to my off-street spot.
Right, absolutely. I think it's worth saying that what we didn't talk about was process, and this is, and frankly, it's always a danger with planners. I spouted off a lot of cool ideas that other places are doing, and we know they work already, and all these important things, but you can't get to those without buy-in. And I think, or you can, but it it could lead to the disagreements that we see. And so thank you for the question. I think that to a great degree, we know from evidence that the things that we worry about as homeowners, and I'm a homeowner in the city of Charlottesville. I want to be clear about my position here and everything like that. The things that homeowners worry about will my property values go down, or will I not have a place to park, or all of those things, I think can be addressed through first of all having a zoning code that allows for accessibility, that treats context as very important. The example I'm thinking of is that what we do in Greenbrier is not necessarily going to be what we do in North Downtown, for example, just to take an example. But I think that that ultimately the worry about undersupply of parking is often more a worry about, are we supplying, enough mobility to make my neighborhood viable, or to keep it from becoming run down, or whatever it is. And I think the evidence from other medium-sized cities, I mean, we're small, small cities and medium-sized cities, college towns like us, is that we're small enough, we're compact enough that we don't need to actually have as much as much driving as we think we do, that people actually can, accomplish a lot of their daily needs with fewer trips, with fewer vehicles, and that it doesn't really impact people's livelihoods. I think really important to say, and this is something that Donald Shoup would say, and that, I would say as well, is that what we're really doing is what this is really doing is trying to provide choices and options. If somebody feels like their parcel needs to have a certain amount of parking, this is not a parking maximum. I would say there are big cities in the world that have parking maximums. We're not talking about parking maximums. That's an entirely different thing. Removing a parking minimum is simply providing a choice. But beyond that, I think that, what we'll discover in single family neighborhoods that might be becoming denser, this is kind of, one of the things that people were really worried about. We will probably see that in some places there will be less parking provided. A parking district, a parking management district can really address the idea that if somebody becomes, if we have a 3-unit or a 4-unit property that used to be single family or a duplex, we can absolutely manage that, and that the people occupying the new units can bake that into their decision to move there. And that's what they will do. They will know that, all right, if I live here, I might have one space, or maybe I won't have any space, but I'm gonna bike. I'm going to use Ubers when I need to. All of those things are feasible. So yeah, I could go on, but I'll stop there. There's a few ways we can think about that.
Yeah, so kind of a question along the lines of kind of process. What do you think about how parking reforms should be rolled out in Charlottesville? Should we drop all those things at once? Should certain types of commercial districts versus more residential districts, should we do downtown? And should there be some sort of subsidy component as well? What would be your sort of order of operation for making this happen? We're trying to be very practical here.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, there are two paths. There are very much two paths that cities can take in implementing this. And I would say that before I give my opinion, let me just lay out those paths. One is to just go all in and say, across the city, we're getting rid of minimums and we're leaving it to developers, whether you're Piedmont Housing Alliance or whether you're a developer that is seeking to build high cost housing, whatever high income, housing, you do what you want to do. And we don't care anymore. That's not part of your zoning, review. That is not part of how you get your permit to build. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to be more strategic and fundamentally think about where do we provide allowances? Where do we back off of the code? Do we maybe reduce things on, to some degree, but then at the same time give added bonuses for certain actions like the provision of affordable housing, or putting in a district around downtown, or around UVA. Those are approaches we could take, and in fact, I think that planning does better when it tries not to be so universal. That's something that I think is hard for cities, but in Charlottesville, if we think about our neighborhoods as each unique, it is possible to think about things that way. All that said, I do think that with minimum parking requirements, what we're dealing with is 100 years of history, where, as I said, we put our thumb on the scale, and it takes some getting used to, but all we're really saying is that if we remove those parking requirements, we're going to let we're going to let property owners make their own choices. And I do not think it's going to be as radical as everyone does. The evidence is from cities all over the country, and we can share studies afterwards or whatever it is that it doesn't change things as much as we think, but it allows affordable housing to be built. It allows us to make choices about what we want to provide as a society in a way that we just can't right now.
Are there, someone asked, kind of with your idea of maybe not getting rid of parking minimums altogether, at least in certain areas, but sort of having ways that there can be trade-offs where developer says, I will offer X, Y, and Z instead of parking, besides just maybe offering off-site parking. Or they asked if there's anywhere that's adding bike racks, bus shelters, wider sidewalks, or things like that as a relief per parking minimum. Is that something that's been used anywhere that you're aware of?
Yeah. Yes, that is a good point. And yeah, every city can have their own mix of this, but it is really true that, and Charlottesville itself, by the way, has some of these requirements, but we can think about the balance of the requirement of provision of bike parking or fundamentally supplying of a bus stop. There's a lot of things in our transportation network that frankly are not well supplied at the parcel level. And this is one of the challenges we deal with in zoning, is that everything operates at the parcel level and it doesn't always make sense. But I think that some of those things can be required at the level of the parcel, and bike parking would be an example of that. And then other things we need to think about, parking districts. We need to think about, can developers pay into a fund to build bus shelters, to supply shared parking, to fundamentally manage sidewalks and keep them well maintained. All of those things, and by the way, sometimes those are just called business improvement districts if it's a commercial area. We don't do a lot of those things, partially because of the Dillon rule and complexity of being able to have local power to be creative in cities in Virginia. But part of it is just we haven't made the leap to making some of those choices. And so yes, absolutely, providing alternatives and requiring developers to participate in that is something we already do to some extent, and we could do more of.
Kind of along those lines, are there any places that are actually kind of explicitly saying, we'll let you have less parking if you do affordable housing units?
Oh, yes. Yes, there are places like that, and I in order to not be inaccurate, I don't want to say which places they are. Those are things, but yes, that idea of specifically providing a bonus to density for affordable housing without requiring additional parking supply is a legitimate tool that absolutely is implemented in some ways. And you see the way I described it, we might get a housing person to describe it in a different way, but fundamentally the idea is, can we build more densely when we supply affordable housing without needing to provide more of the parking that would come with those units? Yes, that is a policy, and that is a legitimate way of doing this. I still would advocate to say the reasons why we require minimum parking standards are probably are something that are holding us back generally. But I think if we're worried about giving them up entirely, that kind of bonus approach is a fine approach too.
I can totally imagine Charlottesville coming up with a very complicated algorithm to try and
well, you nailed it. That's part of the problem. I mean, we have to feel for the planners working behind the counters and in neighborhood development services and other places, because frankly, we make it incredibly complicated, and it just is upsetting for developers, and it's upsetting for planners, and it's upsetting for the community. Simplification is not a bad thing, and even if getting rid of minimum parking requirements is really going to be utilized more by affordable housing specialists or affordable housing developers, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that we shouldn't just make it easier for everyone at the same time to get their plan stamped. But yeah, exactly. We could come up with something incredibly complicated because we often do.
All right, one more kind of quick question. Just
Sure.
any quick thoughts you have on-street parking, not actually the management of it, but actually reducing it and turning it into things that are maybe better uses of space.
Yes. Yeah, and I didn't talk about that much, but I'm excited to just say quickly, that is really important. So, again, these sound so administrative, this boring terminology of curb management does not sound fun. But at the same time, that is the idea that Seattle is working on, and other localities, that like what we do with our parking spaces should not just be by definition storage of cars that nobody is in. They could be food trucks. They could be parklets. They could be things that rotate, or things that are permanently converted to transit stop, to loading and unloading zones for future autonomous vehicles, which we haven't even talked about. All of the things that in the future might tell us we don't need so many cars on and parking spaces for cars. I almost, because of the time, we didn't talk about that, but that's a whole other topic. Someday, not now, but maybe 30 years from now, why would we, we'll regret having so much parking, and the fact that we tied it, that we made our lives so hard now, when cars only drive themselves and come and pick us up. So I think, yes, that idea of being flexible about the curb is all the rage, and something that we should be thinking about here too, for sure.
All right, well, I'm going to have two quick announcements in a second, but I just want to really thank you so much for taking the time to provide such an informative and well thought out talk that is obviously very complex. But I mean, when you're thinking literally, what is Charlottesville? It turns out Charlottesville is 20% parking.
Yeah.
And I think we would do well to use a lot of that space for more productive things for our city. So I wanted to announce two things real quick. We have finalized a third zoning in Charlottesville event. Exact date to be determined. It'll probably be the first week of June. It'll be on zoning in the environment with Caetano de Campos Lopez and Susan Cruz from the Charlottesville Climate Collaborative. So the event should happen first week of June. That will mean we'll have had 3 events to help inform people ahead of the city starting to ask for feedback on the zoning code. Second thing, a chance to practically act to promote some more housing in Charlottesville. There is a rezoning going before the Planning Commission on May 10th for a 119 unit apartment building on 2005 JPA, which is near the corner where Fry Spring Station Pizza Place is. It will have 125 parking spaces, which is more than I would prefer, but is actually 20% below what the city would typically require under this type of rezoning. And excitingly, the developers are electing, if this were to go through, to pay cash into the Affordable Housing Fund for the city, which they would be paying about $500,000. So if this rezoning were to go through and be approved and this development completed, the city would get $500,000 to give to local housing organizations through the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund. So we'll have some more information on our social media for Livable Cville on Facebook and Twitter. We will also, make this recording available to the folks who joined us to share with your networks as well. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much, Dr. Mondschein.
Thank you very much. Thank you for